Welcome to Marty's Mods. I'm going to start by pointing out the elephant in the room. The Sims 4 has some pretty bad texture issues. But with Marty's Mod shaders, we have a whole toolbox of ways to help fix that, to get me the look I want. Stay tuned and I'll show you how. I'm going to show you step by step how you can use a handful of reshade shaders to create a great looking screenshot in The Sims 4. First, let me show you how I used SceneWeaver to set up my composition. A lot of us crop our screenshots to make them a different aspect ratio, especially if we're taking portrait shots. It's a lot more helpful though if we can visualise what that's going to look like before we even start composing. With SceneWeaver, I can block off the parts of the screen I don't want to use. For this shot, I wanted to use a 4:5 aspect ratio, which is the shape Instagram uses. I also used the rule of thirds grid overlay, which helps me line up the elements in the shot so everything can feel balanced. While composing, I used SceneWeaver Canvas, which gives me the grid overlay and lets me change the colour of the blocked out area. I used a mid-grey colour, which doesn't distract from the part of the image I'm working on. When taking a screenshot, SceneWeaver Canvas doesn't show up in that final shot, which can be great. But for this, I wanted the blocked out areas to still be blocked out, to give me a guide for when I crop afterwards. So I also enabled SceneWeaver Letterbox. This blocks out the same area with the colour black. If I turn off SceneWeaver Canvas, there you see the black bars are still there either side. The black bars from SceneWeaver Letterbox remain visible in the final shot. By placing Letterbox above Canvas in my load order, it means the grey of Canvas still takes precedence and I can still get the benefit of that neutral colour while I'm working. With my composition ready, I can get started with my other edits. To use depth effects in The Sim 4, I have to turn off the in-game anti-aliasing, which can leave me with ugly, jagged edges. So I already have immerse anti-aliasing enabled, which then helps get rid of them. First of all, I need to turn on Launchpad. Launchpad is a utility shader that on its own doesn't really do anything, but is required for several other Marty's Mod shaders. Always keep Launchpad at the very top of your load order. This way, it will apply its settings to everything that comes below it. Make sure you enable smooth normals. I'll show you why in a moment. Let's turn on ReLight. This is probably my favourite shader from Marty's Mods. With ReLight, I can add points of light in any colour and move them around to light up my scene. I want the sim in this picture to be the main subject, so I want to arrange the lights to shine on her. But a quick note first. When you turn on ReLight for the first time, you'll only have 2 lights available. In the current version of ReLight, you can change that to 4 lights by typing 4 into the preprocessor definitions box at the bottom and hitting enter. The shader will reload and then you'll have 4 lights to play with. I'm also going to change the light overlay setting to make sure that I've got spherical representations of the lights I create. This is a big help when you're positioning them. You can see where your lights are. Turning on light 1, nothing changes, because at its default settings it's positioned too far away at the moment from my sim. I can move the sphere position settings, which work along the X, Y and Z axes, to move it around in 3D space. I can move it forward, and there you go, it comes into scene. The default intensity is far too strong for what we want, so I'll reduce that down quite a lot. And then I can change the other position settings and place it exactly where I want it. I'll also change the colour of the light. I want something warm here, so I can move the temperature and tint values until I get something nice. I'm going to add a second light, this time on the other side of her. I need to reduce the intensity of this one too. When moving the lights, I don't want to illuminate every part of her. I like the effect it has when I move the lights back just a little bit, so they're roughly at the same distance from the camera as my sim. I'm going to change the colour of this light too. When placing lights either side of a subject, I often find that having one warm and one cool colour can work nicely to create some contrast. So I'm going to choose a cool colour here. I'm going to change the ambient intensity now. This controls the overall level of light in the scene. That is, a light that was already there, not the lights added by me. If I reduce this, the whole image gets darker, leaving behind just the lights I added. I think this makes ReLight more impactful. At this point, now I've chosen the colours and rough position that I want and set the overall ambient intensity. If I need to, I can spend a bit of time tweaking the lights to be in exactly the right position, have the right colour and be the right brightness. can also pay attention to the object thickness setting. ReShade can't really tell how thick models are in 3D space, so sometimes we have to help it out. Look at the shadows that fall in the background. As I change the object thickness value, the shadows being cast change. Adjust this until the shadows make sense. Now I'm happy, I can turn off the light overlay and then they won't get in the way of the rest of my edits. Before I move on, I said I'd show you why you want to have smooth normals enabled in Launchpad. Let's turn it off. See? This setting is especially important in a game like The Sims 4 which has low poly models. Smooth normals help smooth everything out again and avoid all these horrible blocky textures. Next I'm going to turn on RTGI. This provides ambient occlusion and bounce lighting and is what is often called ray tracing. I have my quality set to ultra, just as I had ReLight's quality set to maximum. I'm taking a still screenshot so my frame rate doesn't really matter, and I can really crank up the quality of all the shaders to get the best result. The default settings are quite high, so I'm going to reduce them until I get the look I want. In a more cartoony, stylised game like The Sims 4, I'm not aiming for accurate realism. I can be a bit more creative with my settings. Different scenes might require different settings, even in the same game. I want the bounce light to be obvious, and because this is a relatively dark scene, I have to raise it higher than I might in a normal well-lit street scene, for example. I've turned the specular section off because in this scene it won't really benefit from it. Just like with ReLight, I have the option to change the ambient intensity in RTGI too, but I've already done that in ReLight, so I don't need to do it again. Let's turn RTGI on and off and see what impact it's had. Off, on. And let's turn ReLight off and on again and see what impact that's had. Off, on. RTGI already has ambient occlusion, so you don't need to use MXAO alongside it, but in The Sims 4, especially when I'm taking a portrait shot, I like to add it in to give more contrast to the main subject. Again, I have the quality set high, but the settings here are quite forgiving, so you can play around with them. In most cases, you'll want to change the sample radius to best fit your scene, but because, like I said, I'm not going for realism here, the default settings actually work quite nicely. All I'm going to do is increase the intensity. And if I turn it off and on, yeah, I think I'm happy with that. Before we start fixing the texture issues I talked about at the beginning, I'm going to move on to colour grading. It's best to get ReLight and RTGI set up before we do this, because it saves you some time and avoids having to keep going back and forth between them. Turning on LUT Manager, I already have lots of multi-LUTs saved over in the add-ons tab. I know which one I want to use. I made this LUT myself, especially for The Sims 4, to reduce some of the blue shadows the game has. I always enable it before I start the rest of my colour grading. Back in the shader settings, I can adjust the chroma and luma intensity of the LUT. I'm quite happy with how it is at maximum intensity though, so I'm going to leave it like that. Turning on ReGrade, I'm only interested in the calibration setting. I've already selected it in slot 1 and going down to the settings, changing Lab A offset and Lab B offset gives me some initial grading to balance out the underlying tones, and I can use that as a foundation for the rest of my colour work. If you want more of an overview of why calibration is a powerful and useful tool, take a look at the Colour Grading Oblivion Remastered tutorial on this channel. The link will be down in the description. Next, I'll move on to ReGrade Plus, which is the add-on version of ReGrade. This is where I'll do the majority of my grading. Starting with the high dynamic range section, I'm going to adjust the shadows, darks, lights and highlights to help give me the right balance that keeps the focus on the subject and gently lets the background be less prominent. Sometimes you have to come back to this section once you've tweaked other things, but that's fine for now. Towards the bottom of the ReGrade Plus window are a couple of really powerful colour grading tools. I'm going to use both of them, starting with split toning. There's no right way or wrong way to decide which tool to use or in which order. Colour grading is often about going backwards and forwards until you get the right balance. You can adjust the values here in a couple of ways. You can grab the centre dot and pull it around within the colour wheel, or you can use the hue and saturation sliders underneath. I'm going to use the sliders. I always start with the midtones and I pull saturation roughly halfway to begin with so I can see any hue changes more clearly. When I slide the hue slider from side to side, it runs through the whole spectrum. I can keep doing that until I find the right spot. A lot of this is intuition at this stage. You'll know when you've found the best spot, it'll just look right to you. Then I can adjust the saturation slider again to get the right intensity. Then I can do the same for shadows and highlights, moving the saturation slider to the middle and then moving the hue slider from left to right until I find a good spot. Going down to the hue versus luma wheel at the bottom, I have my second powerful colour grading tool. If I click on the circle at the top left, I can switch between hue versus luma and hue versus saturation. I'm going to start with saturation. Each dot here represents a different colour, and I can grab and pull them to anywhere else in the circle. If I pull them outwards away from the white line, that colour becomes more saturated, and if I pull them towards the centre, they become less saturated. I can also move them from side to side, which will change the overall hue. I want the reds to be slightly more warm, so I'm going to pull the red dot a little more towards the orange side. I'm going to increase the saturation of the orange dot just a little because I want everything to feel warm. I want those bright yellow fruits in the foreground to be warmer too, so I'm going to pull the yellow dot towards orange. There's quite a green tint in the shadows, and I think I'd prefer it to be more neutral, so I'm going to pull the green dot more towards the centre. Now I'm going to do the same with the cyan and blue dots. If I switch back to the hue versus luma wheel, here I can adjust the lightness of each of the colours. If I move the dots from side to side, this will also change the hue again, but moving them in and out only controls the lightness, so that's what I'm going to focus on. I don't need to do too much here though. Now I'm done with colour grading, I'm going to add in some bloom with Solaris. You could do this before your colour work, it doesn't matter too much. The more you use reshade, the more you'll discover your own preferred workflow. Under pre-processor definitions at the bottom, I've already enabled Solaris's artistic mode. This gives me access to more types of bloom. I'm fond of the autumn bloom, so that's what I've chosen, but I recommend playing around with them, see what they do. Autumn bloom's a bit of a balancing act. Raising the bloom intensity makes it more bloomy, but also makes everything a bit darker. So you can balance that out by increasing the log exposure bias, which in layman's terms is just how bright everything is. You can also experiment with where you place Solaris in your load order. The colour of the bloom will change depending on whether you have it above or below your colour grading. Tweaking reshade and taking screenshots is an artistic process, so place it wherever gets the result that you like the most. Solaris added a little softness to the image, and I want to make sure my sim is still well defined, so I'm going to turn on local Laplacian here. I don't want to set it too strong, just enough to add some local contrast. I'm done now with my colours and lighting, but there are still some issues with this image that we need to fix. I talked at the beginning about The Sims 4 and its bad textures. That scale dial in particular has been really upsetting this whole time, hasn't it? The fruit and vegetable produce in the scene is really low poly to the point where it's really distracting. I can also see some texture issues with the chalkboard at the back, as well as with my Sim's clothes. I've got 3 shaders though that can help me with all of these problems. First, let's look at debanding and film grain. These 2 shaders work really well together. I'll start with Deband. Your monitor only displays a set number of colours, so sometimes, especially in large areas of flat colour where there may be very subtle gradients like in the sky, there might not be enough colours available to display a gentle transition between the gradients, so you get what's called colour banding. In The Sims 4, the textures are often quite small and also display artifacts. Deband can help us get rid of both of these problems by blending everything together a bit. I've turned off automatic bit depth detection because it gives me more control over the settings. If I wanted to, I could set this to only apply to the sky, but here I want to smooth out quite a lot of the textures. Because of how bad the textures are in this game, I need quite aggressive settings, which, as a side effect, will destroy some of the finer details. In more realistic games, you want to avoid that, but The Sims 4 is cartoony and actually very forgiving. So I've dropped the bit depth down 1 notch, and I've also brought the debanding search radius down as well, and that just avoids losing too much detail. Even though I've tried to balance it, I'm still left with textures that are perhaps a bit too smooth. This is where film grain comes in. Film grain is actually a really great way of debanding too. Introducing a grain pattern helps mask those awkward areas of transition. But in this case, I'm primarily using it to add some texture back into those large smooth areas, like on her coat. I have the film mode set to colour, and I've chosen analog film grain because I like the pattern it produces. Turning the intensity up and turning it down, you can see you don't really need too much to make a big impact. I don't want the final image to be dominated by grain, so I'm choosing quite a low intensity here. Can you see how when I turned film grain off and on, it gives that final boost to the textures and makes it feel a bit more cohesive? At the bottom, I have options for analog film gamma and shadow emphasis. This is a little like push and pull processing you find in traditional film developing. Increasing gamma will brighten the image a little, and increasing shadow emphasis will deepen the shadows and add some contrast. I often use these settings as a final little tweak to the overall contrast of the image. An important thing to note here is that if you're using Deband, you want it to be one of the very last shaders in your load order, so then it applies to all the other shaders above it. And if you're using film grain alongside it, you want to move grain below Deband so that Deband doesn't destroy the grain pattern. The final problem I'm left with is those distracting models and low resolution textures. I can't magically make them high quality, but I can hide them. For this, I'm going to use depth of field. I always use this as my last step once I'm happy with everything else, but you can enable it earlier in your workflow if you prefer. You can also experiment with where you place it in your load order. That might end up depending on which other shaders you're using, because some of them don't interact very well with DOF and can lead to strange outlines if placed below them. One rule is that you always want to keep DOF below ReLight, RTGI and MXAO. I used to have DOF placed a bit higher than I have it now, but it was interacting badly with one of the other shaders, so I've dragged it down and that problem's gone away. Just like we had to pay attention to our load order for Deband and film grain earlier, you always want them to be below DOF so that the grain isn't blurred away, and so Deband works on any banding that might be introduced by the blurring of the image. Onto the main settings. I have the focusing mode set to manual focus, which gives me fine control over exactly where I want that focus to lie. You can use automatic mode if you find that easier though. I have the bokeh quality set to maximum, which can be pretty resource intensive on some hardware, but as I said earlier, I'm just taking a still screenshot, so my performance doesn't matter at all. I've got aperture roundness set to 1, which is going to give me perfectly round bokeh discs. Foreground and background blur multiplier are both set to 1, which means I'll get blur in the far plane behind my focus point and in the near plane in front of my focus point. This is what's going to help us draw attention to my sim while hiding all those awful textures and models. Before I spend too much time adjusting the focal plane, which places the focus where I want it, I'm going to change the overall intensity of the blur so I can see what I'm doing. I'm going to do this by adjusting focal length and aperture f-stop. These settings simulate how a real camera lens works. Focal length in a real lens adjusts the zoom level, and f-stop adjusts how much light gets through the lens to hit the sensor or the film. Both of those also affect the strength of blur, and that's what they do in this DOF shader. You can adjust just one or the other if you prefer, but I like to move between them until I get the result I want. Increasing the focal length is like using a zoom lens. A 50mm lens would be quite wide, and a 200mm lens zooms in. The effect it has here is that a low number like 50 will have a lower blur strength, and a high number like 200 that I've chosen will have a much stronger blur. F-stop works similarly, but the opposite way round. A low f-stop of something like 2 will have quite strong blur, and a higher f-stop of 5 or above will see the blur get weaker. It also controls how quickly the blur drops off. A higher number will let more of your subject be in focus. This does all sound confusing, I know. It does help if you have a background in photography, but once you've used the settings a few times, you'll quickly get the hang of it. Now I can see my blur, I can move the manual focus plane depth to position it exactly where I want. I tend to look at the eyes because they're one of the most important parts of a portrait. As long as they're sharp, everything else comes together. I can continue to adjust the focal length and f-stop to get the right strength of blur and the right amount of drop off. In this case, I want the blur to be a little stronger nearer to the camera so it hides that produce at the front a bit better. To do this, I'm going to increase the foreground blur multiplier. I think I've successfully managed to deal with quite a lot of the little problems we had at the start of this. Pretty happy with the finished result. I hope this has helped you see that not only can Marty's mod shaders change lighting to stage your shot with ReLight and RTGI, and alter colours to change the mood with shaders like ReGrade, but there are also ways to help solve some common issues that we often have with games. So let's compare the before and after. You can see in the finished picture the grey from SceneWeaver canvas has disappeared, but I still have those black bars either side from SceneWeaver letterbox, and that's going to help me when I want to crop my picture. Thanks for joining me today. I hope to see you next time here at Marty's Mods.